Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The Cave That Whispers My Name. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The Return. Ethan stepped off the bus and onto the cracked pavement of the old town square, dust swirling around his worn boots. Everything about this place felt smaller, like he'd outgrown it the moment he left. He adjusted his backpack, squinting at the once familiar streets lined with faded storefronts and peeling paint. After so many years, he'd sworn he'd never come back to this town, but his father's death had left him with no choice. The house, the family land, he had to settle it all. And then he could leave for good. He started down the street toward the edge of town, drawn more by habit than by memory. Houses grew further apart, yards widening until they faded into fields and thick woods. The silence was a strange thing here. His city life was loud, filled with background noise he barely noticed anymore. But here, the quiet settled in, thick and heavy, pressing into his ears. It felt like the whole town was watching him, waiting for him to remember. He stopped by the edge of the woods, feeling the familiar rough bark of a tree he and his friends had carved their names into long ago. He traced the faded letters, his fingers trembling slightly. Just beyond these trees, the land sloped down toward a cave. The cave. They used to play there all the time, as kids, making it their secret hideout, a place for daring each other to go deeper. But one summer, he'd forgotten why, but he'd stopped going back. As he brushed his hand against the tree, a strange, soft sound drifted through the air, a whisper carried on the breeze. He froze, tilting his head to listen. It was faint, barely more than a sigh, but he was sure it was there. It sounded like his name, stretched and hollowed out by the distance. His heart pounded against his ribs as he took a few shaky steps back. The last thing he wanted was to visit that cave again, but the whisper pulled at him, dragging him toward the tree line. He clenched his fists, planting his feet firmly on the ground, forcing himself to turn away. But as he walked back toward town, the whisper lingered, a soft, insistent call that dug into his mind, refusing to let go. It felt like the cave itself was calling him back, awakening a memory he had long buried. And somehow, he knew this wasn't the last he'd hear of it. Chapter 2. Memories Unearthed. That night, Ethan lay in the cramped bedroom of his father's house, unable to sleep. The old springs of the mattress groaned beneath him, mirroring the unease twisting in his gut. Outside, shadows leaned against the walls, cast by the faint moonlight creeping through the blinds. He squeezed his eyes shut, but each time he drifted off, he was yanked back to the same place, the cave. In the dreams, he was a kid again, standing at the entrance to that dark maw carved into the earth. The cave seemed to breathe, alive and shifting, its shadows stretching toward him like fingers curling around his name. He could hear voices, the echo of laughter that wasn't his, yet sounded close enough to bring a chill down his spine. The name he heard the most wasn't his own, but it was one he knew too well, Jake. He jolted awake, breath ragged. Jake. He hadn't thought of that name in years. His best friend, his partner in every secret they'd kept as kids, the one who dared him to explore that cave in the first place. Jake had disappeared there, one summer, slipping into the shadows, and never came back. They'd said it was an accident, that Jake had fallen or wandered off, but deep down, Ethan felt the weight of something he couldn't place, like he knew more than he was willing to remember. Unable to shake the feeling, he pushed himself off the bed, the floorboards creaking as he paced. The whisper from earlier played in his mind, a gnawing sound that seemed to grow louder the longer he stayed in town. Was it really calling him? Or was this guilt crawling out after years of silence, digging up secrets he'd long buried? Ethan looked out the window toward the woods, shadowed and ominous under the night sky. He knew he shouldn't go back there. There was nothing for him but old bones and memories better left forgotten. Yet, each time he thought of leaving, of just turning his back on this entire mess, he felt it the pull. It was as if the cave held something he needed, a piece of himself he'd left behind with Jake all those years ago. But why now? Why was it calling him back after all this time? The answers, if they even existed, lay buried in the dark. And with each passing night, the whispers grew stronger, like Jake's memory, relentless and inescapable. Chapter 3. The Descent Begins. By dawn, Ethan couldn't take it anymore. The whispers hadn't let him rest, gnawing at his thoughts like something alive, clawing its way back into his mind. He'd spent the early hours scouring his father's study, searching for answers, anything to make sense of the memories flooding him. That's when he found it, an old, leather-bound notebook stashed behind a stack of dusty papers. Faded ink scrawled on the cover chilled him his father's unmistakable handwriting. With a trembling hand, he flipped through it. Page after page was filled with warnings, fragmented thoughts about dangers in the cave, about things his father had apparently experienced there as a young man. "Stay out," one note read, "or be ready to face your fears." The warnings barely registered. It was as if a cord tied around his chest tugged him toward the edge of town, the woods, the path leading to that place he knew too well. Flashlight clutched in one hand, the notebook in his pocket, Ethan took his first step inside the cave. The air felt different, dense, as though it hadn't been disturbed in ages. Shadows flickered against the stone walls, dancing as his flashlight beams swept across them, revealing strange symbols carved into the stone. He couldn't remember if they'd always been there, or if his mind was just playing tricks on him. He reached out to trace one, a jagged line twisting into itself, and felt a chill crawl up his spine, prickling the back of his neck. He could swear he heard something, a faint whisper, just beneath his hearing, like a secret shared only with the darkness. He pushed forward, deeper, every step feeling heavier, as though the ground itself tried to hold him back. Then, a voice echoed from further inside. "Why didn't you come back for me?" It was Jake's voice, unmistakable but hollow, almost broken. Ethan froze, his pulse thundering in his ears. Was his mind fracturing under the weight of buried guilt? Or had he truly heard it? He pressed on, each whispered phrase growing clearer, cutting into him with painful familiarity. "You left me." The walls seemed to close in, the space tightening with each step. Every sound, every whisper took him further into his own mind, the memories raw and haunting. With every accusation that echoed around him, he felt the weight of something he'd run from his whole life until now. Here, in the cave, the truth felt closer than ever. And so did something else, something watching from the depths. Chapter 4. The Past Unveiled. Ethan pressed further into the cave, the flashlight beam trembling as he moved. Each step felt like peeling back layers of his own mind, the past sliding closer with every breath. Shadows clung to the walls, but it was what lay within him, surfacing from the depths, that made his skin crawl. Vivid flashes, a hand reaching out, laughter echoing seized his mind like a film reel playing images he didn't want to see. Jake's face kept appearing before him, smiling as he'd looked that last day. Why hadn't he gone back? The question sliced into him, sharp and cold. He'd always told himself that Jake had simply wandered off, that it had been a tragic accident, but as the cave walls pressed closer, as if to contain his every thought, Ethan began to wonder if there was more to that day than he remembered or wanted to remember. A metallic glint caught his eye in a crevice along the cave floor. Ethan crouched down, reaching into the shadows, fingers brushing something small and hard. He pulled it out, heart twisting as he stared at it in his palm, a small, rusted keychain, the one Jake had shown him the week he disappeared. The faded charm of a grinning skeleton hung from it, mocking him in the dim light. It had been their pact, their shared dare to explore the cave. If one of us finds this, the other will come back and get them. The guilt hit him like a punch, filling his lungs with the stale air of the cave, too thick to breathe. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd broken some unspoken vow. Memories flooded him, bits and pieces that had slipped through the cracks of time, forming a picture he could hardly bear to look at. Jake had been scared that day. He remembered now how his friend's voice had wavered, pleading for Ethan to go with him deeper. Ethan, though, had laughed it off, daring Jake to prove himself while he'd stayed behind, certain he'd re-emerge. But he hadn't. Shivers ran down his spine as another memory surfaced, a distant, frightened scream echoing in the cave that day. He hadn't come back. He'd run, filled with an unease he hadn't understood then, but which consumed him now. And now the cave seemed to close around him, each step further darkening the path. Somewhere ahead, he swore he saw movement, a fleeting shadow, a silhouette that could have been anyone or anything. But he couldn't turn back now. Every piece of the past he rediscovered tied him closer to this place, bound him deeper to the truth he'd been running from. Gripping the flashlight tighter, he pressed forward, haunted by the sound of footsteps echoing from the depths. His own, or maybe Jake's. Chapter 5. Shadows of Regret. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps as he ventured deeper, feeling the cave close around him, shifting with each step. The narrow path twisted in unnatural ways, each bend feeling tighter, darker, as if the walls themselves pulsed with life. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, shapes that shifted from mere patches of darkness to human-like figures that almost reached for him, their hands stretching out of the rock, fingertips nearly brushing his skin. He recoiled, clenching his fists, feeling a chill seep into his bones as the whispers transformed from faint murmurs to voices that seemed inches from his ear. "You left him," the words slithered into his mind, and he froze. "You left me." The voice was his own, a child's, trembling, accusing. A flickering light illuminated a figure just ahead. Small and hunched, a boy in a torn jacket, shoulders drooped with sadness. It was him, as he'd been the day Jake disappeared. Ethan stared at his younger self, too horrified to look away, the flashlight slipping from his hands and casting wild beams against the cave walls. The boy raised his head, eyes hollow and piercing. "Why didn't you come back?" The words seemed to echo forever, bouncing off the walls, each repetition sharper, sinking deeper. Ethan shook his head, trying to speak, to defend himself, but the boy's gaze cut through every excuse he'd ever told himself. He had run, abandoned his friend when he should have stayed. The weight of his own shame bore down on him, rooting him in place, every step forward becoming more impossible, the path shrinking until it felt like he was crawling through his own memories, forced to relive each choice. He turned to leave, heart pounding, the urge to escape overpowering, but the shadows around him seemed to pull him back, twisting the path into a narrow chokehold that left him gasping. He couldn't escape. The cave wouldn't let him. With every inch forward, it closed tighter, pressing down on him, forcing him to continue. His hand brushed a jagged edge in the wall, and in that instant, he remembered it all, Jake's terrified face as he begged Ethan to come back, the hollow silence that had followed when he hadn't. The memory hit him like a slap, sending him to his knees. But something was wrong. The memory felt warped, stretched as if pieces had been twisted, faces overlapping, voices blending into threats and pleas. With a trembling hand, he reached out, brushing the stone wall, feeling it give slightly, like flesh. The whispers grew louder, insistent, their tones shifting from blame to something more desperate. "Help me. they cried, voices that felt both familiar and foreign, leaving him cold and desperate, trapped and lost within the depths of his own regret. Chapter 6. Revelations in the Dark. Ethan stumbled forward, hands scraping against the rough cave walls, the whispers swelling around him like a storm. The words clawed their way into his thoughts, dragging him back into the day he'd locked away, the day he and Jake had gone into the cave together. His flashlight flickered, casting ghostly shadows that twisted into familiar faces. Each one whispered his name, the echo building until it was Jake's voice, filling the cave with the terror Ethan had tried so hard to forget. In a sudden flash of memory, he saw it, the two of them, 12 years old, gripping their flashlights as they delved into the cave, daring each other to go deeper. They'd laughed at first, daring the shadows to scare them, their voices echoing off the walls. But something had shifted. The air had grown cold, and the shadows began to stretch unnaturally, curling like fingers reaching out from the dark. Jake had turned to him, fear flashing in his eyes. "Ethan, I don't think we should be here." The memory was as sharp as glass. He'd heard Jake's voice tremble, but he'd just laughed, egging him on, determined to be the braver of the two. They'd ventured deeper until Jake stumbled, flashlight skittering from his hand and disappearing into the depths. And then it had happened, a crack. "Ethan," the voice was desperate, pleading. He could see Jake's face now, dirt-streaked and terrified, reaching out, fingers just inches from his. And in that moment, as the ground shuddered, Ethan had panicked, instincts taking over. He'd turned and ran, leaving Jake's cries to fade into the darkness behind him. Ethan sank to his knees, hands trembling. All the guilt, the years of running from this moment, came crashing down on him, pulling him further into the cave's darkness. The whispers were no longer just echoes, they were memories, haunting him, accusing him. "You left me," Jake's voice hissed, and it was closer now, his friend's voice twisted by pain and betrayal, each word dripping with accusation. The shadows began to coalesce, forming a shape in front of him, a figure standing just a few feet away, eyes hollow, face pale, twisted with a look Ethan could barely stand to see. It was Jake, or something that wore his face, a ghostly imitation that reached out, arm extended, finger pointing, each movement slow and deliberate. "Why didn't you save me, Ethan?" Ethan's throat closed up, unable to breathe, his pulse thundering as he tried to back away, but his body wouldn't move. The apparition's face twisted, no longer a boy, but something monstrous, a shadow with Jake's face contorted into something barely human, its mouth stretching into an accusing scream. Whether it was real or his mind cracking, Ethan couldn't tell. All he knew was that he was trapped, the weight of his past pressing down, unrelenting, in the darkness. Chapter 7. Confronting the Darkness. Ethan felt the weight of Jake's gaze, the accusing look seeping into his very soul. The apparition stood before him, its form flickering like a candle in the wind, half-formed and malevolent. "You ran, Ethan," it said, voice echoing around him, each word dripping with resentment. "You left me to die." The cave swirled around them, walls bending, shadows twisting into grotesque shapes that danced in the corners of his vision. The whispers escalated, a cacophony of familiar voices amplifying his guilt, distorting the reality he thought he knew. Every step he took felt like a step deeper into the pit of his own making, the air thick with the past he had tried to bury. "Why didn't you help me?" Jake's apparition pressed, eyes hollow, yet demanding. Ethan's heart raced as the image warped, transforming into a kaleidoscope of memories, fragments of laughter, shared secrets, and that fateful day etched in pain. "You could have saved me, but you chose fear over friendship." Ethan staggered back, but the shadows closed in, forcing him to confront each painful memory. The laughter faded, replaced by screams, echoes of their childhood friendship now tainted with betrayal. "I didn't mean to," he shouted, words spilling out like a desperate plea. "I was scared. I didn't know what to do." "Fear? You let fear drive you away." The apparition reached out, fingers brushing against Ethan's arm, cold and unyielding. "You can't run from this, Ethan. You must face it." The cave vibrated with energy, shifting and swirling, a living entity demanding he choose. Ethan felt the shadows tightening around him, trapping him in a web of regret. He realized then that this was a test not just of his will, but of his heart. To escape, he had to confront the very darkness he had avoided for years. As he took a deep breath, he let the memories wash over him, his childhood self, the laughter, the joy that turned to horror. "I was afraid," he admitted, voice trembling. "Afraid of losing you, afraid of what was happening. But running away only made it worse." With those words, the air shifted. The shadows twisted, coiling tighter, demanding he relive the pain of watching Jake disappear. "I have to face it," Ethan whispered to himself, feeling a spark of resolve ignite within him. The cave presented him with a choice, a path leading back to the entrance, to a life burdened with guilt, or a path deeper into the darkness where he might confront his fears. "Stay and confront the darkness within," Jake's apparition urged, the weight of their past hanging heavily in the air. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped forward, choosing to face the shadows of his past rather than flee from them. The cave trembled with anticipation, and he knew, for better or worse, the confrontation was finally at hand. Chapter 8: Escape or Entrapment. Ethan took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the stale, damp air of the cave. Shadows swirled around him, but he stood firm, heart pounding as he faced the apparition of Jake. "I'm sorry," he said, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I'm so sorry I left you. I was scared and didn't know how to help. I thought I could escape the darkness, but I only ended up lost." With each word, the cave shifted, its oppressive weight lightening just a fraction. Jake's figure flickered, uncertainty flashing across his features. "Do you mean it?" the apparition asked, voice echoing with a mixture of anger and hope. "Can you really let go of the fear?" "Yes," Ethan replied, feeling the knot of guilt inside him begin to unravel. "I know now that I can't run from my past anymore. I accept what happened, and I accept that I was wrong." The shadows shrank back, retreating, as if they could sense the sincerity in his voice. Suddenly, a path appeared, illuminated by a soft, inviting light emanating from the cave's entrance. As Ethan moved closer, he could feel the shadows recoiling, whispering, their voices fading into a soft, almost melodic hum. Each step felt like a release, the burden of years pressing down on him, lifting with every inch he covered. But as he stumbled into the daylight, squinting against the bright sun, he felt a wave of exhaustion crash over him. The outside world was vibrant and alive, yet a hollowness lingered in his chest. He was free, yet haunted, the weight of his past a constant echo in the back of his mind. As he turned to leave, he heard it, the last whisper of the cave, faint but unmistakable. "Ethan." It curled around him like smoke, slipping into his ears and settling in his heart, a reminder that some wounds run deeper than the skin. He hesitated, glancing back at the cave entrance, now appearing darker and more foreboding than before. The shadows danced at the mouth of the cave, a dark invitation whispering promises of secrets yet to be uncovered. For a brief moment, Ethan felt the old pull, the familiar, seductive call of the darkness, beckoning him to return. He shook his head, trying to dispel the thoughts. "I'm free," he whispered to himself, yet doubt crept in. Was he truly free, or was this merely the beginning of another cycle of torment? The cave stood still, watching him, waiting. As he took a step away, the weight of its presence loomed large behind him. He couldn't shake the feeling that a part of him would always be bound to that darkness, always tempted to revisit the pain that had shaped him. With one last glance, Ethan forced himself to turn away, walking into the light, but knowing that the shadows would always linger just out of sight, ready to whisper his name whenever he faltered.